So we come now to look at the Chiffchaff as the final talk for this morning. Should be looking at more about Chiffchaffs. When I was younger, I used to think that all sorts of things were Chiffchaffs. I'd never heard a Chiffchaff actually singing before, and therefore I used to try and fit Chiffchaff to everything. So perhaps you've heard, the great tits teacher. I used to try and fit Chiffchaff to that, and then say that it was a Chiffchaff. Of course, I was wrong, because great tits and Chiffchaffs are very different, and the calls are very different. But having not heard a Chiffchaff, I did not know exactly what they sounded like. I'm afraid I'm not going to give you a vocal demonstration now, though. But there was an article again on the Chiffchaff in the last issue. Another of our writers who wrote that article for us. And this was my first attempt at photographing a Chiffchaff. Can you find the bird in that picture? By any chance, can anybody find the bird in that picture? The photograph is terrible. It wasn't a particularly nice day, if I remember rightly. I was out with some friends who had invited me to come with them fishing. And, well, I heard a Chiffchaff singing. I actually heard a Chiffchaff singing. I heard a proper Chiffchaff, not a great tit or something else. The sort of, I suppose you could call it a dripping tap noise, which is so common in the spring. It was this dripping tap noise, and I looked and looked and looked because the trees, as you can see, had greened over. It's probably about June or July. And I was looking all over the place trying to find this Chiffchaff because they're so small that they're hard to see, but they are constantly moving, which means that you can catch sight of a movement in the trees, even if you can't see the actual bird. And I did manage to find this one eventually, and I took a picture of it. Here is a computer improved, if that's improved, picture of the Chiffchaff. It was, of course, just here. That was the Chiffchaff, sort of half obscured by this branch and partially sort of obscured by the light. Picture shows you the Chiffchaff, but it doesn't really do justice to it because it's still not a very good picture. But generally speaking, Chiffchaffs are dull birds. They're warblers. You may have heard of the group of warblers. For the most part, warblers are pretty dull. To be honest, warblers don't normally have very colourful plumage. They're usually a mixture of greens, browns, perhaps greys. The blackcap has a black head, but apart from that, the rest of the body is grey. They're sort of nondescript, but they usually do have quite pleasant songs when they sing in the spring. You can often, it's lovely to hear them, different species singing their various different songs. The Chiffchaffs is no different, of course, but sometimes a Chiffchaff singing, it can get a little bit annoying when you're just hearing this repeated Chiffchaff, Chiffchaff, Chiffchaff. Some people would argue it ought to be Chiff-Chiff because there's not that much difference between them. But there we are. Now, we often have Chiffchaffs in our garden. We don't live anywhere particularly special. We live sort of, I'd say, in a housing estate, but it's got quite an old housing estate, so have quite a big garden. There's a lot of greenery around, a lot of it, and so we do see Chiffchaffs, but they don't breed here. In this particular area, we do not have Chiffchaffs actually breeding in the immediate vicinity, this is. They only pass through in the autumn and the spring. They do breed in our local woodlands. There you can hear them throughout the summer months, singing away or calling. You can find them sometimes where they are nesting, very rarely, because they are so secretive, it's hard to find them. They usually feed in the canopy, which doesn't really help, very high up. They can be found lower down though, which helps immensely. But what happens is we can always tell spring and autumn because of the influx of chiffchaffs that we have. Outside here, we have a maple tree. There's often one or two found in that at some point in the autumn, feeding on the very insects they can pick off of the leaves. But it's lovely to see them up at quite close range, when often you're struggling to see them in the treetops. So autumn, of course, is now almost over here. We've had the chiffchaffs passing through. They've come down and they've been around and about. We've heard them calling and seen them, one or two of them around and about, especially early in the morning. That's a good time to find them. And now there's hardly any left. I did hear one this morning in the area, but for the most part, they have gone. So I can't really ask you to go out and find a chiffchaff because that would be asking too much. And this is another shot from, I think that was last autumn, to be fair, of a chiffchaff in our garden. And it was just sort of going in and out of the fence, a bit like a wren would normally, looking for the insects that it can find off of the, I think it's a privet hedge that's there. And you can watch them from our kitchen window going up and down the garden on that left-hand side. Now, we also have an apple tree outside the kitchen window, and you can see here, there's a chiffchaff in the picture, almost dead center. There's a little chiffchaff, just the head showing. You can see that there. And often in September, October, there's lots of leaves still on the trees. So sometimes it's hard to see them, even in September and October, because of the fact that there are leaves obscuring them. There's a slightly enlarged version of that. You can see the bird there in the tree. But it was a close thing as to actually getting that picture, because they were hard to photograph because it was moving so fast. And subsequently, I didn't get much better than that without any leaves obscuring them because it was too difficult. And small birds like chiffchaffs usually feed on insects. They spend much of their time searching for insects amongst leaves and amongst the bark on trees and things. And sometimes in the autumn, they will actually turn from insects and they will feed on other things. So for instance, they will feed sometimes on berries, sometimes on some sort of fruit. So the fruit from an apple tree wouldn't be the most surprising thing to see a chiffchaff eating. I didn't see one on this occasion, but it wouldn't be unheard of. And there is a very similar species, as I think the article outlined, of warbler called the willow warbler. Now, you may say there's a big difference between that bird and this one. They look entirely different, but they don't, because the light is predominantly what's wrong there. They basically look the same. They're paler, but sort of grayish and greenish below, and then darker brown-green above. They're pretty much the same. In plumage, they are very difficult to separate. The song is what separates them. Normally, the willow warbler has a very descending sort of trilling song. Perhaps you can look that up later and have a listen to it online. The chiffchaff, of course, is a chiffchaff. And it says chiffchaff, chiffchaff, chiffchaff. So the other difference actually in colouring is in the leg colour. Chiffchaffs usually have black legs. Willow warblers usually have pale legs. And so you can tell them apart by that. But how many people can actually see the legs of these birds? Normally, you just want to see the bird. Seeing the legs is very difficult as well. And if I were to go into the fact that willow warblers have slightly longer wings than chiffchaffs, then it gets even worse. There's pretty much no way of telling except for by the song. That is reliable most of the time. Sometimes, you may not believe this, but I know it's true. You can have willow warblers or chiffchaffs, because nobody really knows what they are, singing a song which is a combination of the willow warbler's descending trill and the chiffchaff's playing chiffchaff, sort of a bit of the one and then a snatch of the other and then a snatch of another, which is most odd, but it is as it is. It's been heard on a few occasions. That's the willow warbler. There's also another one, which is, I'll say, reasonably similar, but much less common. It's called the wood warbler. Now here, you note the clean white underparts. Usually the willow warblers and the chiffchaffs, they have coloured underparts to a certain extent. The wood warbler has clean white underparts. The face is this sort of light green colour. The extent of it down on the breast varies. Sometimes it comes down further than on others. But otherwise they have this sort of same colouring above. And they can look surprisingly similar to chiffchaff sometimes. But again, the song and the call is very different. They can be easily told apart by that. The wood warbler's song is a short, fast trill, you could say. You have to hear that really to know what it sounds like properly. Really quite high-pitched, and it's a lovely song to hear. And they're usually located by some noise that they make, these three warblers. Because without the noise, you wouldn't know they were there, you wouldn't be looking for the movements, and subsequently they could pass unnoticed. That's sometimes why warblers are often missed, because they like dense scrub, they like dense shrubbery, and therefore they're not so easy to see as other birds. But if we look then and compare their distributions, respectively, this is the chiffchaffs. Chiffchaff, you may know it as a summer visitor. But really and truly, there is a good population in Britain which is resident. It stays throughout the year. And that's marked by the green on this map. The yellow is, of course, the summer only. Now, I would say that probably this map is entirely inaccurate because local populations are going to differ. It could be that it depends on the immediate local vicinity, which will define whether it's resident or summering or not. This is just a rough guide. There are patches where they stay for summer only and migrate south for the winter. There are patches where they are resident all year round. Those patches are undefined and quite variable. I think that is where we shall have to leave that. But compare this with the willow warbler. That's a boring map because it's yellow all over. There's obviously some parts of Scotland which they're absent from, but there is nothing there apart from the summer residents. They're very rarely found in Britain in the winter. They all go south. And this is the wood warbler. The grey indicates where they are absent. The wood warbler, as I think I mentioned before, is quite a rare bird, and therefore they're generally found in the west for the most part, and they are strictly summer visitors. Again, not many, if any, over winter in Britain. Now, talking globally on a slightly bigger scale, chiffchaffs are found in quite a small area, really. They're really common in Britain, and they winter in North Africa, but of course some stay in Britain. There's some in France and Germany, Holland and Belgium who will stay over winter as well. I couldn't put that level of detail into this map, but that is a general sense. But look at this instead. This is the willow warbler. Now, okay, they're not found in all of Russia, but I couldn't highlight some parts and not others. So they inhabit enough of Russia to justify me including Russia in this. They can be found right the way over. And you can see that it's sort of southern Africa here that they winter in. Northern Africa, about the equivalent of the chiffchaffs, is actually their passage zone. They just pass through on passage. They don't breed there, they don't overwinter there, and they don't do anything else there. They just pass through. That's where they pass through. And they summer, of course, in Europe and also in Russia and a few other places. Now, the wood warbler is more like the chiffchaff. Only even the wood warbler migrates further south than the chiffchaff. As you can see, Northern Africa, where the chiffchaff usually overwinters, is a passage area again, for the most part. and Spain and Portugal and a few other nations around the fringes get missed off, which were there in the Chiffchaff population. So we see there the general broad ideas of the populations of the three species. The Chiffchaff and the willow warblers are the most common. Wood warblers are quite rare. Now this is another BTO bird track graph. Being a much more common species, one might take this as being a little more accurate. As you can see, there's two peaks. Again, one in the spring, around March, April, May time, and another in the autumn. If you look at week 43, there aren't that many left because most of them are summer residents. And there aren't all that many that overwinter, though there are enough. I think there may be a little more than this graph depicts, though that may be only because of my local knowledge. It may not be a Britain-wide thing. But mostly the peak is in August, September, that second peak. It's coming up to it. And now we're down to the last dregs of the summers and the few which will remain for the winter. That's pretty much all that will be left of them now. Now, it's almost time to have the break for lunch. But one more thing, I have a few activities for you if you would like to do some of these. So you can look up and memorize Psalm 103, verses 15 to 16, and then try to think about what those verses are actually saying, what those verses actually mean. I shall just read them now. As for man, his days are grass, as a flower of the field, so he flourisheth. For the wind passeth over it, and it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more. Just think about those words and see if you can memorize them as a challenge for you, since we looked at a plant this morning. And then do some research on the subject of ragwort. See what you can find out about the plant. And then, as I think I mentioned earlier, you can look up get a map or something of England, and then you can look to see the points where there's jutting out into the ocean, where you might be able to see common scoters from. And then listen to the song and the call of the chiffchaff and the willow warbler and the wood warbler if you really want to. The RSPB website's often good at giving that sort of thing, but also Zeno Canto, if I've pronounced that correctly, is another good website for looking up calls and songs. And then find some geese, if you can, not necessarily Brent geese, but any geese, and see if there are similarities between them to other species of geese, perhaps like Brent geese, greylag geese, Canada geese. Greylag in Canada are the most common. You can probably find some of them without too much trouble. So if you would like to, go and see if you can do those things. And we will be back this afternoon. I will end this Zoom call shortly, and we will be back this afternoon at 2 o'clock, I think, 2 o'clock, when Philip Snow will be doing a live art workshop for us, which we're very grateful to him for offering to do these for us. And we look forward to that later. So have a good lunch break, and 2 o'clock we will be back. We'll be letting people in from the waiting room. The meeting will be live from 1:45. So make sure you come back for Philip later, and we will see you then. Goodbye for now.